Hello, good evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove, and here we are starting on our next step in this biblical walking tour, which is the second book of Samuel. I just want to talk briefly about the first three chapters, the first four chapters actually, which is really the story of the ascent of King David, first to the throne of Judah, then to the throne of Israel. And it is a ascent that is paved with the corpses of his enemies. First of all, we're told the news arrives of the death of King Saul and his three sons at the Battle of Mount Gilboa. But the person who brings this news is an Amalekite. These details don't quite add up with the details we've had in the previous book. This Amalekite comes and says, I brought you the crown, and I killed Saul, who was his life was lingering, but I ran him through at his own request, and I brought you the crown. Whereupon King David orders the Amalekite to be killed. So the Amalekite has done him a favor by getting rid of his arch rival, but King David has the Amalekite killed because King David now laments the death of Saul. Now we can imagine that King David laments the death of Jonathan, who was his best friend, but he laments the death of Saul as well and the other two sons. In fact, the death of Saul is incredibly convenient for David, and the death of the three sons as well, because that's three rivals out of the way. But in fact, David, having persecuted the house of Saul for so long and gone over to Saul's enemies, the Philistines, now makes out that he is Saul's greatest admirer, or rather maybe the editors of this book have done so. And we have David's magnificent lament over Saul and Jonathan. Now, this lament is ascribed to David, but it might be in fact by somebody else and just put into the text at this place. But the lament, which is chapter 1, verses 17 and 18 onwards, is a magnificent piece of poetry. I regret to say the translation in the Jerusalem Bible is not, in my humble opinion, very good, because it doesn't really make much impact in English. It is from this lament we get this phrase that is still in the language, how the mighty have fallen. And David supposedly says, may neither rain nor dew fall on you, Mount Gilboa. And then we get this extraordinary confession, and this probably makes us realize it is David speaking here. Jonathan, by your dying, I too am stricken. I am desolate for you, Jonathan, my brother. Very dear you were to me, your love more wonderful to me than the love of a woman, which is rather an extraordinary admission. Well, David is distraught with grief, although I think it's rather hypocritical grief. Maybe it's not hypocritical is too strong a word. Maybe it's the grief we all feel that when we finally get our way, we realize it's not what we wanted after all. Now, the love of a woman. He laments Jonathan, but of course, in a few moments, we'll see that Jonathan's sister, his original wife, Michal, he doesn't care about her at all. In fact, he's extremely cruel to her. This is beautifully treated, incidentally, in Michael Arditi's novel, Anointed, which is about the reign of King David told from the point of view of the women. It's a very good book. The narrative we have here is disjointed and incoherent, but one thing is clear. Chapter 3, verses 12 onwards, Abner is now going to, who is Saul's general and right-hand man, is now going to betray Saul's surviving son, Ishbaal, and David is going to enter into negotiations with Abner, but he says first, you don't turn up here without Michal, who, you remember, had been given to David by Saul and then taken away from David by Saul. And so he said, I purchased her for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. So Ishbaal sent for her to be taken from her husband, Paltiel, son of Laish. Her husband set off with her and followed her, weeping as he went, as far as Bahurim. But Abner said to him, go back, and he went. What does this tell us? It tells us that Ishbaal and Abner, for political motives, decide to break up a happy marriage in order to give Michal back to David without consulting Michal at all, and giving Michal back to David, who doesn't care about her at all, but it's presumably a matter of prestige. You took this piece of property from me, now give back my piece of property. A matter of prestige, a matter of principle. But doesn't give two hoots about Michal at all. Michal, who incidentally once saved his life. Now you think that Michal, who'd done that great service to King David, would now be left in peace. But oh no, King David's pride insists that Michal be brought back to him. He's already got 6 wives, we're told, because this is in verses 1, 2 to 5 of the chapter. He's got 6 wives and 6 sons. Maybe he's got more concubines and so on and so forth. It makes no difference to David whether Michal is married to whoever she's married to. The fact that she's happy and having a nice life, no, that means nothing to him. It's his ego that really counts. Yes, you're guessing right. I really don't like King David. I think he's a monster. Now, the monstrousness of King David is shown again by the fact that Abner comes to negotiate with King David. King David then allows Abner to go. Joab turns up, who's King David's right-hand man and his chief general. Now, Abner had killed Joab's brother. Joab hates Abner. Joab lures Abner back and murders Abner when he is defenseless. He calls him aside by the city gate as if to speak to him and stabs him. Whereupon King David, and here the hypocrisy is really manifest, very glad to have got rid of Abner, surely, who is the power behind the throne of his rival Ishbaal. King David then makes a huge performance of grief about Abner and curses Joab, and indeed all of Joab's family, but doesn't sack Joab and doesn't punish Joab and keeps Joab in his job as his chief general. Later on, we'll see Joab comes to a nasty end, and that is supposedly because he's paying for the crime of Abner. But King David doesn't do anything about it right now because he needs Joab, doesn't he? And then, of course, King David's enemies have all seemed to have bitten the dust, which is hugely convenient, including Abner. And then finally, the last person standing in the way of King David, well, 2 people are standing in the way of King David, the last 2 males of the house of Saul, one of whom is a cripple, Merib-Baal, the son of Jonathan, so he's not a rival because he can't be king. And the other one is Ishbaal, who is the 4th son of King Saul, who is clearly not very effective because throughout this war of attrition between David and the house of Saul has been steadily weakened. So Ishbaal is then murdered. 2 of his men creep into his house when the doorkeeper is asleep and he's asleep on his bed, stab him, cut off his head, take the head to King David. And what does King David do? When they bring him the head, he doesn't say, "Thank you, you've got rid of my rival. Well done." Oh no, he has them killed because he says here, how much more then when bandits have killed an upright man in his house and on his bed? Am I not to demand an account of his blood from you and rid the earth of you? David then gave an order to the men who put them to death, cut off their hands and feet and hung them up beside the pool of Hebron. So they didn't get a reward for doing this service to King David, just like the Amalekite who announced the death of Saul and brought him the crown didn't get a reward. So suddenly all the people who stood between King David and the throne of Israel have been cleared away. King David is clearly very popular. Incidentally, King David is the founder of public relations. And when he's made his big fuss over the death of Abner, and all the people wept for him louder than ever, we're told. The people then all tried to persuade David to have some food. Verse 35 of chapter 3. And worse, while it was still daylight, but David saw this earth. May God bring unnameable ills on me and worse ills too if I taste bread or anything until the sun is down. Remember, you fasted after somebody was dead to show that you were sorry that they were dead. All the people took note of this, and it pleased them. Indeed, everything the king did pleased the people. In other words, the only person who seems to see the hypocrisy of King David is, well, me and maybe other readers, but the people at the time, everything the king did pleased the people. Everything the king did. His hypocrisy is seen, his mourning for Abner is seen as something, completely admirable. In other words, now what we call hypocrisy is good actions which have got bad motives. Whereas they say just see the good actions at face value. They think what a wonderful king King David is. Everybody loves him. Does this tell you something about modern politicians? I rather think it does. King David is an ultimate, consummate politician, and yet they all love him. He's a Teflon king. Nothing sticks. His cruelty, his capriciousness, his hot temper, and his sheer schemingness, the way he effortlessly ascends to power, none of this rouses any suspicion at all. It's amazing, isn't it? Well, then David becomes king, and that happens in the 5th chapter of 2 Samuel. So we've covered 4 chapters, the ascent of King David to the throne. All the best. Bye.